Welcome back, everybody. Today is, well, I don't know what day it is, but today we are going to talk a little bit about TED Talks and some public speaking and presentation techniques that can help you deliver the best speeches that you can. First of all, what is a TED Talk? A lot of you might be familiar with it, but for those who are not, TED is an acronym TED. T, technology, E, education, D, design. A TED Talk is a very popular format of speech in which researchers and practitioners love to share their ideas by giving a talk that is about 18 minutes or less. TED has a motto, which is ideas worth spreading. So the TED speech is a new format of speech that emphasizes visuals and compressed time frame. The maximum talk is only 18 minutes, and a use of more dramatic gesture or creative presentations of information. For anybody who is interested in some further reading on this topic, I gleaned most of these insights from a book called Talk Like TED by Carmine Gallo. So, if you're interested in exploring some of these public speaking techniques in greater depth, or perhaps finding some inspiration for a future presentation, this is the book for you. So, in his book, Gallo talks about 9 different presentation techniques that he sees many different TED speakers use to deliver dynamic, interesting, and compelling presentations and speeches. For the sake of this lecture, I've chosen 5 that I think will apply well to this class. And so the first one is master the art of storytelling. Human beings evolved to tell stories. Way back in the old caveman days, 10, 20,000 years ago, when people would sit around a fire and they would tell the history of their people through stories. Human beings, we have the brain wiring to remember information and concepts through stories. Stories are what draws our attention. Stories are what keep us coming back for more. That is why movies and television shows and novels are so popular. We are drawn to compelling and interesting stories. As Gallo writes, stories turn abstract concepts into emotional, tangible ideas. We tend to remember things better when it's more connected to our emotions, and storytelling is a really good way to unleash that emotional potential. As one TED speaker, Brene Brown, once put it, stories are data with a soul. So if you have a lot of interesting facts or figures that you want to make more interesting to an audience, sometimes talking about it in a story can be a lot more helpful. And finally, as Gallo writes, stories are who we are. We all want affirmation that our lives have meaning, and nothing does greater affirmation than when we have our experience affirmed through a story. And one is from a woman named Lisa Christine.
I'm 150 feet down an illegal mineshaft in Ghana. The air is thick with heat and dust, and it's hard to breathe. I can feel the brush of sweaty bodies passing me in the darkness, but I can't see much else. I hear voices talking, but mostly the shaft is this cacophony of men coughing and stone being broken with primitive tools. Like the others, I wear a flickering, cheap flashlight tied to my hair with this elastic, tattered band, and I can barely make out the slick tree limbs holding up the walls of the 3-foot square hole, dropping hundreds of feet into the earth. When my hand slips, I suddenly remember a miner I had met days before who had lost his grip and fell countless feet down that shaft. As I stand talking to you today, these men are still deep in that hole, risking their lives without payment or compensation, and often dying. I got to climb out of that hole, and I got to go home. But they likely never will because they're trapped in slavery.
Number 2, teach me something new. Or another way to put this is finding ways to express ideas in new ways. Contrary to what students might say, learning can be very addicting. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to show that when you learn something new, it activates the same parts of the brain as does drugs and gambling. So when we have the pleasure of learning something new, it activates a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And as one researcher once put it, dopamine is like the save button of the brain. So when we have that joy of learning something in a new or unique way, it can really help us remember and let that information stick in our minds. Only through seeing your own world through a fresh lens and a fresh perspective will you be able to give your audience a new and fresh idea to look upon. I want to show you an example from a statistician, a man who does statistics, named Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling shows a really intuitive graph that compares two variables of countries. On the y-axis, you have the child mortality, the percentage of children who survive into adulthood. And on the x-axis here, you have GDP per capita, in which means if you take all of a country's money and you divide it among its citizens equally, how much money does that come to? Check out his very interesting way of showing different data trends around the world.
But I would like to bring you back to about here at 1960, and I would like to compare South Korea, which is this one, with Brazil, which is this one. The label went away for me here. And I would like to compare Uganda, which is there. And I can run it forward like this. And you can see how South Korea is making a very, very fast advancement, whereas Brazil is much slower. And if we move back again here, and we put on trails on them like this, you can see again that the speed of development is very, very different. And the countries are moving more or less in the same rate as money and health. But it seems you can move much faster if you are healthy first than if you are wealthy first.
The next TED tip that I wanted to share is lighten up, use some humor. Human beings have a really wonderful way of connecting to each other when you can speak truth to power and when you can make unpleasant topics a little bit more palatable by sharing it in a way that helps people to laugh. When we laugh, we can connect with others. Laughing is a great way that human beings bond with each other. As Gallo writes, when you can combine humor and novelty, you have presentation gold. And humor really helps lower your audience's defenses. When I'm giving a presentation and when the audience is listening to a presentation, it's easy to get nervous and tense. Humor is a great way to break that tension and to allow everybody to relax. And when they're relaxed, they're more receptive to the information and to the message. Again, we will revisit Sir Ken Robinson because I thought his TED Talk was in fact quite funny, as evidenced by this example.
I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6 and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl said, "They will in a minute."
Number 4 that I chose is to paint a mental picture with multi-sensory experiences. In other words, sometimes verbal explanations are just not enough. Sometimes it really helps your audience to use things like images or props to give audiences multiple ways to take in pieces of information. There is a professor named Dr. Richard Meyer, in fact, who ran many different studies about multisensory learning. And he said that students who were exposed to multisensory environments, such as text, pictures, animations, and video, always, not sometimes, always, had much more accurate recall of information than students who only listened to the information. So when you can incorporate visuals or some kind of realia, for example, a real life item into your speech or your presentation, it can make it a lot more engaging and a lot more likely for students or other teachers to listen and absorb your message. One of the big elements of TED Talks is to use images to replace words whenever possible. If you look at a PowerPoint presentation for a TED Talk, it is very image heavy. There are very few, if any, words that the speaker uses. In fact, Carmine Gallo actually did a study on the PPTs of different TED Talks and found that the average one had about 40 words. Not 40 words on a slide, about 40 words total. Sometimes single words or pictures can tell a much more compelling message than simply a wall of text on a PowerPoint slide. So let's look at an example here of a woman who uses props in order to really open up her TED Talk with a powerful statement.
So I didn't always make my living from music. For about the 5 years after graduating from an upstanding liberal arts university, this was my day job. I was a self-employed living statue called the 8-Foot Bride, and I love telling people I did this for a job because everybody always wants to know who are these freaks in real life. Hello.
And finally, stay in your lane. In other words, be authentic. What does it mean for someone to stay in their lane? Well, it's a kind of metaphor. Everybody is a car. We are all driving on our own road of life. And it doesn't help you to try and drive in someone else's lane. It doesn't help you to try and live the life of someone else. The best life that you can live is the one that you can think of as best for yourself. As Gallo writes, stay in your lane, hold the space, be true to your authentic self, the best representation of yourself that you can possibly be. This is really important for delivering a presentation because if we're not careful, sometimes our grammar explanations or our teacher talk can come across as very dry or very not interesting because we're trying to simply teach material that someone else wrote down. So when you deliver a presentation, as Gallo writes, your goal should not be just deliver a presentation. It should be to inspire your audience, to move them, and to encourage them to dream bigger. I want to finish this section with a little quote by Sir Richard Branson. He once said, "Work is not separate from play, and play is not separate from work. They are all living." So be true to yourself and your identity as a teacher when you consider how you present your lessons or how you might give a presentation to colleagues. Here is one example of a brain scientist named Jill Bolte Taylor who injects some of her own spiritual wisdom into what is actually a very science heavy TED talk.
Right here, right now, I can step into the consciousness of my right hemisphere where I am the life force power of the universe. I am the life force power of the 50 trillion beautiful molecular geniuses that make up my form, at one with all that is. Or I can choose to step into the consciousness of my left hemisphere, where I become a single individual, a solid, separate from the flow, separate from you. I am Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, intellectual, neuroanatomist. These are the we inside of me. Which would you choose? Which do you choose? And when? I believe that the more time we spend choosing to run the deep inner peace circuitry of our right hemispheres, the more peace we will project into the world, and the more peaceful our planet will be. And I thought that was an idea worth spreading. Thank you.
So that's all I have to say today about some of the wisdom that we can get from listening to TED Talks. I hope that you found this helpful or useful, and I can't wait to see you in class next time. Until next time, cheers.